the discussions that we are having over these weeks, we are doing what in the corporate world is called SWOT analysis. We're doing it because of a planning process that we're involved in. It's going to help imagine our future SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so we've had a little time for you to share what we believe are the internal strengths. What strengths lie within this congregation that are, at least to some degree, under our control. And what are the weaknesses internally within this congregation that are at least somewhat under control. If you have something you want to add, grab me after class or anytime in the next few weeks, and we'll add to those. We're going to take just a moment to talk about opportunities. Opportunities are external. Something beyond our congregation, out in the world around us, out in our culture, in our city, in our world, in our neighborhoods, wherever it may be, external to us, which we may not have control over. What are our opportunities? Think about where we are at this time. Think about where we are in the city. Think about where we are in our families or in our neighborhoods, something external to this church. What are the opportunities for this church to be the church that God is calling us to be? That if we just took advantage of it, we could be living into God's preferred future for us. Opportunities out and among us. It's harder than strengths and weaknesses internally, isn't it? But if we don't think about what's out there, we're going to miss. Because, and I'm talking partly to prime the pump, and partly because I want to give you time to think. God is not waiting on us to get out there. God is already out there. God is already involved in our neighborhoods. God is already involved in this city. God is involved in lots of people that do not even recognize Him. Our task is not to wait until we figure out what God wants us to do. Our task is to join the work God's already doing if we would just see God there. So, what's God up to? What's God doing? What are the opportunities that exist at this time in this place?
I'll start. Sometimes when we're driving through the property on a weekday, especially weekdays in the evenings, we see mothers using our parking lot to walk children. We see skateboarders out, and what we know is that we actually have a property line that goes all the way up that could bridge an entire apartment complex to probably all the way over to the Centerville apartments. So that could be an opportunity. Or we have people who are coming in to use our property.
Right. Yeah. And they're welcome here, but I'm not sure we are always here to welcome them.
Yeah.
And say, thank you for coming.
Yeah. Right? Yeah.
Right.
They don't always know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. What else? You?
I think that this church is like most churches, and I'm new here, so there are a lot of us in the congregation who are already involved in something as an individual or as a family, but other people in the church don't know about that because we don't necessarily have that opportunity to share. So if we begin to share those things with one another and involve other people in that could grow.
So there are things that we can do as a church family in sharing the opportunities that we're each experiencing in our own places, our own homes, our own neighborhoods, our own work, etc. And if others do, there might be, connections made and opportunities out there. Sandy. What else? What are the opportunities? Let me try to pump a bit more. We've just come through, we're not out of, but we're in a different place in terms of the global pandemic. We're coming out of the pandemic. We know all the downside. It won't take us but a second to talk about the downside. Is there an upside? Right now, as we grow out of this pandemic, what are the opportunities that the pandemic may have brought? Any?
Well, I think one thing a lot of small families have experienced was there more closeness, more dinners together, more things. And at least the people I've run across, I see what it looks to be like, more yearning for closer community connections, close community connections in their neighborhood, and people wanting to get active. It seems to be true. We certainly have an opportunity there.
I think that's well said, that after all of this time in which we've spent so much time within our smaller group, there's a yearning for people to be with people. Yeah.
Well, I think our online service has really grown dramatically. Not only in attendance, but just in the way we do it and the way we've grown and made it better, and it's still evolving.
Yeah. So out there, so we've got some of our members that are not able to come to church, and so there are more than I have known who are attending our worship service as a part of this worship family every Sunday that don't even live in San Antonio. That come to participate in the singing and the sermons and whatever out there, who need that kind of connection that can only come through our live streaming. So, yeah, beautiful.
We even had online services in China today.
Yeah, we did. We essentially, I know of at least one person or one family in Denver and one person or family in Boston that are with us most weeks.
I wouldn't be surprised if Stacy didn't have somebody else with her.
Yeah.
She was watching just by herself.
Oh, I'm sure that's right.
We got a couple things.
All right.
One, we may have an opportunity out at Boys Town. If anybody has any contacts out there, I would like for them to talk to me. But this is in the process. If there's anything that we can do to associate ourselves with them. One other thing that I'm guilty of not doing this, but this neighborhood community center over here, we've got like an annual get together, and I want us this year to be able to go over and have a meet and greet or hot dogs or something. So there's an opportunity there.
Yeah.
And it kind of dovetails what your wife.
Yeah, like Lisa said.
It's a local community here that we have an outreach.
In fact, some of us have talked about for some time how great it would be if we had a family life center similar to what the old building apparently had. I never was a member at the old building down 281, but a lot of the neighbors came to play basketball, etc. But one way of doing it is have a family life center here. One is to adopt family life center in these neighborhoods. We'd have to join somehow, but they may not allow us to do that. But instead of saying, don't come over here, maybe that we need to be involved there. So, other comments before we move on. It's just helpful for us to think beyond ourselves and to think of the opportunities out there. These are interesting times. And especially at a time of dramatic polarization in our country and in our world. It's been a long time since our nation has been as polarized as it is. That's a downside, and that makes things difficult, but it is also an opportunity. We have the opportunity to be the people of God who love each other and serve each other and would do anything for one another without judgment, even when we disagree.
Amen.
Even when we disagree. We are a church that is in a position to display a different spirit than what is common in our world, so that whatever our political stance or our cultural values, we can choose to love one another anyway. And that's the witness that unity of a Christian family is to the world. And that's the witness that we want to have, which is the segue I'm making to our discussion today. If you have some other opportunities that you want to share, please do. We've got plenty of time in the next few weeks to process those. I'm not assuming that everyone has read this book, nor do I care. I'm not selling books. The purpose is to have a conversation about Northside, about our world, about our community, and recognize what time it is and what's going on around us. As I said a couple of weeks ago, I did not write this book about Northside, and yet pretty much every page of it is applicable. So a quick summary. Chapter 1, churches are dying. Churches of Christ all over, especially North America, are diminishing and dying. Some churches will die because they just get so small and wither into nothingness, close the doors, sell the property, and are done. That's happening almost one a week in North America. Some are dying because we've forgotten who we are. And so we go through the rhythms and we have the services and we do the programs and we don't even know we're dead. We miss all the signs. But one way or the other, we're going to die, because either we will shrivel into nothingness, or as an act of community surrender and discipleship, we will take up the cross together. We'll either die by closure, or we'll die by discipleship. One way or the other, we're going to die. There's going to be an elegy either way. And what I'm hoping for, what I and many of you are seeing signs of, is there may be resurrection for this church family. Because God is doing surprising things among us. And there are acts of discipleship happening every day. I'm sorry, May. You said you didn't want to talk, and you don't have to. I'm going to talk about you. Okay? I'm sorry. I just have to get this in advance. I know you don't like the attention anyway, so but let me.
I'm surprised at the announcement this morning. Wednesday classes are over.
Oh, no, we're having a class about singing in here. Y'all come. We're going to have a class about singing in here. Come and sing and learn the new song. Yeah, we'll talk about this after. I promise. Here's what I want to say. I want May and Presley are almost charter members. Almost charter members of this church. I don't think you were here the first Sunday, but you came as soon as you could. I've known them a long, long time.
We came down to the Northside there, 84.
Yeah. And this is, the church has moved and changed. We've had new people. Things are different than they used to be. Not everything that we do are made and Presley comfortable with. I hear it and I feel it. And here's what I've heard from May over and over again. I don't like that, but this is my family. And so when I'm talking about discipleship and an active discipleship by the congregation, these are my idols right here. You want me to say anything else? I say that because I love you. You guys are amazing and I'm grateful.
I have a real good friend out of Kentucky, and his son lives here.
Yeah.
And he lives just right next to a river. And I've invited him to my congregation many times. He's here for my birthday.
Yeah.
Anyway, I said, you need to come to church here. He said, I can't, because it's nice. He said, but I like to go to church.
Good church.
And we grew up, he grew up with our children at Leonard Drive and in Kirby. And they were small churches, I'd say 200 or so. But it was pressing on there quite a ways from the church out of Kirby. So we got to do regular. Everybody would take maybe a little TV and we'd watch Cowboys on Sunday afternoon, play games.
As any Christian should do. As any Christian should do. Watch the Cowboys on Sunday.
Anyway, the children played, you know, it was great. He says, I miss those days.
Yeah.
I said, I do too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Times have changed.
Yeah.
You know, I keep telling myself, God's word hasn't changed.
Great. No, it hasn't. And we can have that kind of community here and now in this church. We can. We can be that kind of church.
We used to always, we used to have a visitation work.
Yeah.
If we had visitors on Sunday morning, we were out on Monday night visiting.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't do
And
that anymore.
yeah, no, some of what's going on. I'll tell you stories.
We don't do a lot.
Yeah, I'll tell you some stories. But I love and appreciate you both more than I can express. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my husband and I are from Idaho.
Yeah.
Well, we moved there from California. My husband retired. We decided to move out of California, so we moved to Idaho. Okay, we lived in a small little town in Idaho, and there was a Church of Christ there. And my husband and I at the time wasn't in the church. So when we got there, I said, it's time we get back in church. We went to this little church and there was about 20 people there in the town. And we stayed there until there was only 3 people left in that little church, because when the families, their kids grew up, they moved to Boise, which is a large town and colleges there. Their kids went to college, so they all moved away to bigger places, bigger cities, towns. So that little church died, and finally, the guy that had his name on the church, the little church, he wanted to sell it. So what could we do but sell the church? And we gave some of the money to the church in Lewiston, which we traveled 75 miles to go to Lewiston Church every Sunday. Which was okay, because we had a beautiful drive every Sunday morning. But in this country, the little towns are disappearing, and the churches are disappearing for one reason. That's why in the little towns, the churches of Christ are disappearing, because they go to other churches. When the church closed there, we wanted to have church. We opened our house to have service in our house, Church of Christ service. The people didn't want to do that. Most of them moved to the Christian church, which was 25 miles away. They went to the Christian church. Or they went to the Methodist church there in town. They quit coming to the Church of Christ and they moved on to other churches. So that's another reason why there's so many people that don't go to church, because there's no church there, or else they go to another church somewhere.
Yeah. Now, all of that, thinking about the kind of the crisis of churches, I do want to say that it's one thing for a congregation to close its doors, That's not the same as the church that Christ built. That will always exist. We have a promise about that. This is not about the future of God's kingdom, but it does have something particular to say about who we are and how we do church.
I haven't read your book, and I'm just visiting here, but I did read a review of your book, and I'm very glad that I did. Part of I think the last part of this is about truth, and I happen to work for Elegy.
Yeah.
So what the lady was saying is that it's a process of generational replacement.
Yeah.
There's just not people in the congregations, and we can go back and we can talk about how the baby boomers, the Generation X, millennials, and all have changed, and it's just simply not the same culture that we lived in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s as we live in today. So many of the things, the ideas that we have about how we should do church are based on things we did. Anytime you come across a problem, you're not really trying to solve the problem. You're thinking back in your mind about things you've done to solve similar problems.
Yeah.
And so you apply that to what you're facing now. We can't throw our line back to the 1950s anymore. We have to throw it forward. The situations are just so different in our secular world, in our post-Christian era. So I don't want to jump around, and I haven't read your book. I don't want to cast any new lines of thought, but I think it's important that we do understand that we live in a different age, we live in a different world. Secularism is taking over. The philosophies are all different. They were founded long ago, so we're dealing with a lot of things that we really can't help. How do we navigate in today's world?
Some things we used to do not work anymore in this culture. The church, the way we remember it, is not the church as it always was, and it's not the same church that other people remember. We all have a sense as to what things were in the good old days. That's a part of what our chapter 3 is about. In the good old days, in the golden days, back when, things were great. Well, things were great for some people, they were not great for others. And the church that I remember may not be the church that actually existed, because others experienced a different kind of church, and the church over there is different. That the problem with our memory is that our memories are faulty, and other people's memories are different. It's one of the things that makes church difficult. But chapter 1, we said church is dying. Chapter 2 says choices have consequences. We have choices to make. And choice was made in the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, that unity was not important, but that restoring a first century church, and if you disagree with me, we could not worship together. If you and I disagreed, we had to split. This was the choice that was made by many, not by all, in the beginning of the 20th century, and we have seen in many of our lifetimes, but certainly over the last 120 years, split after split after split after split after split, because unless we agree on everything, we cannot worship together, and that's not this movement at its beginning. This movement at its beginning was committed to unity, even though there were differences. At the beginning, this movement, I'm not talking about the beginning of Christianity, I'm talking about, you can trace pretty much every church in San Antonio back to an original church. What's the original downtown church? Grove Avenue. Grove Avenue. Yeah. It all goes back to Grove Avenue, and Grove Avenue goes back, and then it goes back, and it goes back, and it goes back to the night. You can just kind of trace pretty much every congregation back to an original impulse, and that original impulse was about being united even though we differ. They didn't call themselves a restoration movement, they called themselves a unity movement. Restoration movement became the term of the 20th century. It was a new term, and that has consequences. It's not that restoration by itself is a terrible thing, But when you have restoration apart from unity, then we lose something essential. Because unity is a part of the gospel that we're called to restore. If we're restoring the doctrines of the church, of the original church, and we say, well, we're going to restore a doctrine related to baptism or Lord's Supper or any number of issues, but are unwilling to restore the doctrine of unity, which is what Christ prayed for in the last hours, if we don't restore that, if that's not important to us, then we have lost something crucial.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
How do you reestablish that unifying concept within a community? People will have grace toward the Democrat, grace toward the Republican, grace to whatever you consider divisive, but what? It could be a multitude. Do we go back and look at Romans chapter 14? And what was that concept all about there? God, who are you to judge God's servant? How do we embrace that and understand that? And then let it permeate the whole body so they can see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the right question. How do we, and some of that's an individual commitment to the Lordship of Christ and to the witness of Scripture, and some of it is knowing our own story. A part of what I wanted to do in telling these stories is to say, we already have in our DNA a heart for unity in the midst of disagreements. That's already in our DNA. Now, it has become in many ways like a recessive gene instead of the dominant gene. But it's not lost. It's not there. We do have actual stories that remind us of what our people were committed to. But you're right, ultimately it has to come, not because it's a part of our story, because some of our story is messed up, as all people's stories are. It ultimately has to come because that's the primary witness in Scripture. So the Romans 14 and 15 passages, some of us were in a Romans class several weeks ago. You've got in Rome Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians that were just frustrated at each other. They could not live with one another because they had different views on matters that they thought were important. Holy days, not eating certain meats, not drinking wine. Jews were on one side, Gentiles were on one side. Jews were essentially involved in their own house churches. Gentiles were involved in other house churches, and that's the setting in which Romans was written. And Paul says twice in Romans, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? Judging someone else because they disagree with you on those matters. Did Christ die for this fight? Really? Christ died, did you accept one another even if you disagree terribly with the other? If you think they're just like wrong. But Christ died for them too. So you choose to love one another. So
Where was the judge of Christ, though, in our restoration of it, not doing that?
Yeah.
We did judge each other.
Yeah. And so that was the change from the early 1830s, 1840s, 1850s into what happened at the turn of the 20th century. In the turn of the 20th century, there was a movement toward judging rather than welcoming. And so if you were a premillennialist in the 1920s, you were kicked out. All right? You believe that Jesus is coming back and going to bring in the 1,000-year reign. You cannot be a Christian. We cannot worship with you. You're kicked out. If you believe in cooperation among churches, you can't fellowship with those that don't cooperate. If you have Sunday schools, you can't worship with those that. If you believe in multiple cups, you can't worship with those that single cup. International Churches of Christ became their own fellowship, just dividing. One of the stories in the book that Lisa and I can recall well, we had several years ago a precious vase given to us by one of our dearest friends at our wedding. And we had a worker trying to fix an alarm just above it, who accidentally knocked that vase over and it cracked in two. I thought I would die.
Well, because they visit our home and they look at the base every time they come.
No, that's right. Yeah, our friends are like, oh no, what are we gonna do? So we took it down to a restorer and asked if he could restore the vase, because restoration was really important to us, and we didn't think it could be restored. If we had gotten that vase back a month or so later, and it was divided into 15 or 20 shards, we would have said, you are not very good at what you do. You call yourself a restorer, and you made it even worse. And it turned out it was just extraordinary. It was a beautiful restoration. If restoration is our commitment, we are not very good at it. Because the history of this fellowship is of division and division. We're not very good at it. Restoring the unity part without compromising truth, without compromising our commitment to Scripture. Restoring the unity part, I believe, is crucial for our future. And if we don't claim it, if we don't work at it, if we don't exercise our commitment to it, if we can't, I mean, we say, okay, I believe in unity in general, but when that Dave Fulbright makes that statement that he makes, I can't accept Dave. If in practical terms I can't accept, I love you, Dave. If I can't accept someone, and this is hypothetical because I don't know a thing that you and I disagree on, we might, but we I don't know. That's why I picked on Dave. But if I can't accept Dave, even if we disagree, then I have a gospel problem. And the church has a gospel problem. Jim Crane.
Well, it's quite a day. You've got Herald of Truth and World Bible School.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the last 6 years of my life that I've devoted to World Bible School has taught me one thing, and that is that we live in a world that needs to know Jesus. And I agree, we've done a lot of wrong in the past, and we've argued, we still do. We're not unified. But I think the real question that I'm asking today is, do we believe people are lost? If we believe that they are lost, then we want to share the gospel of Christ with them. If we don't believe they're lost, I think we just want to be good friends with them. And at the heart of whatever our heritage was, right, wrong, indifferent, good, bad, ugly, there was that thought, people need to know Jesus. And we didn't always do it the right way, maybe. But I feel like what I'm seeing as I travel the state and the country is, at the root of all of this, people don't believe others just need to know Jesus at all. They just want to be friends.
Yeah, there's several really important things. Jim, thank you for sharing that. I think there's several pieces of that we need to bring to the table. Ultimately, it's one thing to come to grips with one's own family strengths and weaknesses. We have strengths, we have some dysfunctions in our family. Any family I'm talking about this nuclear family, any marriage that ignores the past will continue to have problems, and has recognized some things, both our strengths and our pathologies. But the way forward is not ultimately to focus on ourselves. Well, when, we need to get our act together, and then maybe once we get our act together, we can care about others. Because that misses the point. That misses the point entirely. So a couple of things maybe about our witness, and I think that you're right. We have lost over time a sense of urgency about those who are not in Christ. A part of why it is so important for our church to be unified is precisely because of that witness and of that commitment to the world. This is how the world will know you're my disciples. Because you have love one for another. And if we are tearing each other apart, if we can't figure out how to get along, if the only way you can be a part of us is if you conform to everything that a group of us believes, and that's it, our witness to the world is shocked. It's going to be very difficult, because our witness to the world is not just this individual going out and sharing Jesus and that individual going out and sharing Jesus, as important as that is. It's for the church, for us to be a witness to the world, and for us to have a common vision about the world, which is why we are spending some time thinking about our opportunities out in the world. And so there's a both-andness about this. It is not being unified for our sakes so that we can be great people. It is being unified for God's sake and the world's sake, because that's God's nature, and because seeking the lost in the world is God's heart, and finding a way to do it for the larger cause. Did I see a hand?
Sure.
Yeah.
Probably a
No,
yes.
go.
It was you?
No, I want him to go. Come on, Henry. Speak to me.
No, I was gonna, someone, I don't know if I'm young enough for this conversation. Someone said, that we can't throw our lines back, and I think that's a good point. We can't, but I think we can look back and see what happened, because when we look at the present, we can tell that, like you said, the churches are dying, and we can look back and say, well, what happened? And then we can say, well, our weaknesses at that time were not addressed. Maybe they weren't apparent, but for whatever reason they weren't addressed, and maybe we can identify what the problem was, and now we have the opportunity to fix it. So maybe we've been showing up and just showing up for decades. We haven't been forming the relationships that we should form. So people have been leaving because we haven't had a stronger connection with them.
Yeah.
We haven't, like you say, the world hasn't seen us come together and show each other the love that we should be showing each other. So we're getting smaller inside, we're not growing because they don't see the witness that we should be showing them from the outside.
All right, let me piggyback on that for a moment. Because there is a point of looking back to the past, but it's in order to learn and when necessary to change. In the 1950s, when I was growing up, the good old days were the 1930s. For many people today, the good old days were the 1950s. The good old days for some were not the good old days for everyone. And so for African Americans in this country, the 1950s were not the glory days. Not in society, and the commitment to segregation of many white churches was deadly to the kingdom and to real families, real individuals. We have to learn from that. We can't say, well, we just wanted to go back to the way that it was then, because it was not good for everyone. If there is like a son of an alcoholic, my father was not, thankfully, But I know many of you who are a son or daughter of an alcoholic. You gotta come to grips with alcoholism or the abuse that's passed down. Looking back to the past has its purpose, not so that we will get caught in the past, but so that we can learn from our own past, both our strengths and our weaknesses. And we've not done well. We've not done well in connecting to our neighborhood. We've not done well in dealing with racism in our culture. We've got to find ways of doing that. That is an outreach, not a absorption in just the memories of the past. We do it because we have to become different out in the world. Does that, at least in part, coincide with some of the things you were getting at?
I wasn't going there, but I see.
That was well said. That was a score. Did I say anything that was not accurate or helpful?
I wouldn't say not helpful. I wouldn't say not accurate either. But I mean, I think that there's a common thought that when you think about from my experience, when I think about the relationships that I've had throughout my life, I would assume that they're a little bit different than probably everybody in the room, because and when we think about, I guess, since you mentioned racism or segregation and things like that, you don't really think about the fact that at that time, there were people who no one wanted to be around each other. You know what I mean? So and that was probably thought of as the best way to be. So not only did you have white churches not want to participate with white churches, you had black churches who didn't want to participate with black churches. The same way you didn't, the same way you had white people who felt a certain way about black people, you had black people who felt a certain way about white people.
Yeah.
And there was just no trust between those communities, because we didn't really give, I was alive, but they didn't give those people a chance to prove who they were, to accept people as individuals. We're Christians first, and a lot of times this is going way off. We kind of we don't treat people as individuals. We treat them as part of the group that we associate with immediately.
Well said.
Yeah.
But
I agree with you. That was helpful.
I
Sonora?
was going to add on to, when it comes to unity among differences, one of the main ways to accomplish that is to engage in careful and respectful conflict and actually disagree with each other, and then come back and just make sure you're cool. And I think one of the reasons we don't do that is, for one, as the more time we spend alone, especially through COVID, we're not interacting with people. Our kids aren't learning how to have conflict and disagree. But then also, being liked has become so important to all of us. And we might engage in careful, respectful, and necessary conflict, and people never want to speak to us again. And we keep coming back and being kind, and they still have a terrible opinion of us. And that's between them and God. But we still have to go on and have that careful, respectful, kind conflict and practice it. And we will all fail at it a lot and not be respectful or kind as emotions rise. But that's the only way to get better and unify it. So if I never know you disagree with me, we will never be unified in disagreement. Because I'll just think we all agree.
Because unity is not an absence of conflict.
Right.
Unity is much harder than that. It's easy just to play like everything's fine and that everyone agrees, and if someone disagrees with you, just keep your mouth shut. Conflict, loving conflict in the name of Jesus is much harder.
Well, and I think that connects to something we talked about a few classes ago, how lonely people are.
Yeah.
Because we're not letting ourselves be known. Because we want to present the version of ourselves that we think will be more likable. But then we don't get to conflict, people don't know each other, and we suffer in multiple ways. And especially, I think that's one reason our congregations are not strong. We don't know each other because we're focused on what we present as the best, most likable, non-confrontational, no-conflict version.
Yeah. That's it. That's me.
Alright, so there's kind of this concept of looking at the past and the, churches that would divide and divide and divide. And finding differences is a way of, it's like a business model of creating unity. Because if you can point to a difference, you can create consensus within your church to say, this is who we are, right? And I would say that operating model, that breaks people up, right? When you get to, those are like little flames when the impact of your decisions are local, right? You have a small church and a small community, and those impacts of, I'm gonna exclude these people, or, over this issue that defines us as this community, those are cheap fixes for a localized model. And I would say there's something fundamentally different that's happened in the last 20 years, and that social media and technology and communication that has like put everybody into this global space, where now a church, we're flesh and blood people who engage with each other, but we also now have these virtual worlds that we're bringing with us. So you could attend the same church, and now you can self-select your own tribe and identity. And people who are exploiting conflict and differences, it is a part inherent of our human nature that we gravitate towards the conflicts, and because the alarmist in us, that it's, it hijacks higher order reasoning. So what happens is, and I'm just thinking is, what the internet and social media technology and 24 hours in your pocket news cycles have done is it found all of these little flames burning amongst a diverse set of churches that were operating on this model, just poured gasoline on them. And it is like, if our operating model was conflict to drive local unity, there are actors and agents that they do conflict way better than we do, and we now have these nuclear weapons, which are social media platforms, which can create alternate realities for people, even if you attend the same church. And an example of this for your generation is, and I know mine. This is serious business, okay? So, my mom had a youth minister. He died recently. He was from Oak Hills, and you might know him. I don't remember the name, but his wife was widowed and still alive. And she saw me and my brother, talking online. And me and my family, we're faith-based people. We communicate. We care about these things deeply. We want to see unity in our church. And because of all these outside influences, she sent this, this paragraph-long direct message to my mom talking about how, there's a global conspiracy cabal of like where you take up children and they're, harvesting them for their hormones and injecting them. I can't believe that your kids aren't getting on this campaign to protect us from these Satan worshipers. And it's like, this is the blood libel conspiracy that we've had for 1,000 years, and it's now more mutated, and it's now assumed the identity of people that were like the leaders, your generation that were leaders in the church. My mom, I'm certainly looking up to this person as in her youth, just seeing somebody completely get possessed by the tribalism and the environment that these platforms sell, and how we do, is it that people just really don't know who Jesus is or want to talk about Jesus today, or is it that we've lost, we really don't understand the environment that we have found ourselves in, the problems in the environments that have ripped our communities apart, and the outside influences that are telling us that Jesus is something other than what he says he is?
Well, you've anticipated at least some of our discussion next week about threats. And you're right. So, issues aside, we live in a day of outrage, fear and outrage that is stoked by social media. Not exclusively, but it's stoked by social media on virtually every side. And politics is about outrage. and getting people outraged. And so, and there has to be an alternative to living in outrage. And there just has to be an alternative. This is not a gospel way. I'm going to, there are hands in the room, and I recognize we've got a couple more weeks to talk about some things. I want to say something from the very end of this chapter, in part because some of you picked up on a person that is actually being quoted here. This is the takeaway from chapter 3. Page 104. Lisa and I were just visiting Northside. We were not members yet. It was early on when we moved into town. So we walked into a class upstairs and knew a few people in the room. Didn't know the teacher. As class started, visitors were welcome. Announcements were made. The designated donut bringer was chosen for the following week. Considerable time was spent in prayer. Then the teacher, one of the elders of the church, found his place behind the podium and surveyed the room. He gestured toward the single word on the whiteboard. That was last week's lesson. His slow drawl seemed to settle little by little into a barrel of thick molasses. I won't try to keep imitating that voice. I know we're the old folks classy drills, so we may not remember what we talked about a week ago. Pause. A few chuckles flitted around the room. It was unity, he said, smiling, so let me remind you what we said. We have a lot of young folks at this church. Most of us aren't going to agree with them about everything. Shoot, we can't even agree with each other about everything. We're not going to like some things. Pause. He leaned over the podium. And we may not like everything the elders decide to do. Protracted pause. But the point is not that we like everything. The point is how to figure out how to stay together and how to love each other. That's a whole lot more important than whether we like it. The church has got to be united, period. And that was that. Thank you, Barry.
I'm glad I didn't run y'all off.
I did read this to Barry before it was published, even though his name was not there, because I knew it was possible that some folks might recognize that. It says something for a shepherd of the church to say, this church has to be united. We have to be united. We're not going to like everything that happens. None of us likes everything. I've never been to a church in my life where I like everything that's going on. And that's just not the point. It's not what church you like the most. The Hebrew word for this is shalom. Shalom means more than just being at peace. We think of shalom, but we even think of the word peace as a peaceful, easy feeling. I feel at peace, But contentment and peace are different. They may be related, but they're different. Peace is about relationship. So shalom is about relationship. To be in shalom with one another means that we are committed to one another and will serve one another and will help each other and will listen to each other. And whether we agree or disagree has nothing to do with it. At some point, you've got to choose to be in relationship with folks. You do it because God is a God of shalom. We do it because God's calling the world to be in shalom. We do it because we are agents of reconciliation in the world. That God has called us to be in relationship with people in the world who do not know Jesus. And we seek shalom with them. And we call them to shalom with God. Because because God is a God of reconciliation. And so that is our commitment and our heart, and I think our healthiest way forward, our healthiest future.
I don't often say much in class, but so the question is to me over the last couple of years really has been, is the cause of our conflict or the lack of unity, however you want to describe it, perhaps a misunderstanding of what the church's role is? I mean, I think that, I'm just going to say for myself, I think that the church's role is primarily justification rather than sanctification. Then we have a problem. Does that make sense? I mean, we are justified by faith. The role of the church is sanctification to help us grow and to be more holy. So those are the things that we need to be doing rather than trying to do church to maintain our justification or to gain some higher level of justification. So it seems to me, I think we need a re-education about what the church's role is.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's not the justification, it's important that God does the justifying.
Exactly.
It's not because we are righteous, God makes us righteous. So the noun form of righteous is justification. I mean, those are two interrelated words. It's not for us to be the ones who make sure we act righteously. Certainly we want to live well. God makes us righteous. He declares us righteous. The task, maybe the most difficult task, is to relinquish our will enough, our stubbornness enough, so that God can make us holy. That's the sanctification piece. That God is constantly at work on us. We've already been justified. He continues to make us justified. We're named righteous. Now, God is in the work of making us holy.
That's my point. I think you missed the mark that we think church is related to justification more than being made holy.
Yeah.
I think that's, in my opinion, we're getting it wrong, and I think that's the source of a lot of conflict.
There are just a lot of wonderful and helpful comments. Thank you all for participating in the class today. I'm blessed to be in relationship with you and to be a part of this family. Let's end just briefly in prayer. Father, take these words. We're all flawed. We all have blindnesses. We're all scarred. We're all broken. We ask that you make us whole. You make us whole as your children, and you make us whole as a church family. We ask that miracle and that blessing in Jesus' name.